Hey folks, bring everyone. Can someone post in the chat? Someone please post in the chat. I don't know what happened, but yeah, I got kicked out. Here I am. Is this the same chat? Because I see we have a lot of people here. I'm still here. I haven't gone anyplace. I see big numbers here, so maybe and the same number in the super chat. So I don't know. Make sure that all the people from the old chat come here. I called this one continued because I just got booted out of there. Yeah, make sure that everyone comes on board. Bring the people from the old chat onto the new one. I hate it when they do that. It's really, really obnoxious, but there's nothing I can do about it. So, whatever, here I am. Bring the people on board. Bring the new people. Bring folks back while I finish these super chats and make sure that everyone has their questions answered. So, reparations. Reparations. The demand of reparations, the way I've always understood it, is that companies that benefited from the slave trade, that they have an obligation to the black community. That's what reparations is. I support that. I think that companies that benefited from slavery should have to pay something to the black community. And yeah, that I mean, and the way reparations is portrayed, it's as if like the federal budget should be used, and you get very defensive white people who say, well, I didn't own any slaves, so why am I forced to pay? Well, that's not what the demand is. The demand that the black community has always put forward is that the institutions, the big financial institutions that benefited from slavery, have an obligation to the black community. And I agree with that. I agree. So yeah, folks, bring people back in. Bring people back in. I don't know what happened. It was weird. It was very, very weird. But be sure to post on the other chat to bring people in. It kicked me out. I was talking about reparations. It kicked me out. I'm back. I haven't gone anyplace. And we're going to keep talking. So yeah, be sure to bring people from the other chat. Very, very, very annoying. It's a great chat we're having here tonight. I'm having a great time. Welcome back, folks. But yeah, so we talked about, I'm just going through these super chats because we got a lot of them to get through. William Jennings Bryan. So William Jennings Bryan was the Democratic candidate for president in the early 1900s. And basically, here's the thing. So you have to understand what populism was. All right. So during the American Civil War, right, to defeat slavery, the Republican Party was very radical and revolutionary. Their slogan was "Free land, free labor, free men," um, and they were a very, very radical revolutionary party. And they supported labor unions, and they supported small farmers, and they opposed slavery, and abolitionists and the Marxists were in it. There was a lot of Marxists in the United States, and they joined the Republican Party. It was very radical. So after the Civil War, you had Reconstruction, where there was attempts to redistribute land in the South, and public education was invented and brought into a lot of areas of the South, and all of that. But then the Republican Party divided, and you had what you called the radical Republicans, that were the ones that were still like populists and still for the people and still supported labor unions and still wanted to redistribute land. And then you had the moderate Republicans, right? And eventually there was a compromise. The U.S. troops were pulled out of the South. And the Republican Party became an imperialist party. It became a party of big business. So people that were in the Republican Party, small farmers, labor organizers, agitators, progressive anti-racist activists, they formed a new party. They called themselves the People's Party, and they were known as the Populists, right? And it was the Populists, right? And their big demand was, instead of a gold standard, they wanted to have a silver standard because they thought it would be better for small farmers. They wanted to have a silver standard instead of a gold standard, number one. They also wanted to nationalize the railroads. There was a feeling that the railroad companies were getting the land from the U.S. states, that they were getting land unfairly. They ran the government. The robber barons, they called the railroad companies, they called them robber barons. And they wanted that. And originally they were very anti-racist, the populists. They were very anti-racist, and they saw racism as an enemy of the people. And it was a big mass movement. Small farmers, and it was huge. Small farmers, labor unions, they were called the populists, and they didn't like monopoly. Their enemy was monopoly. They didn't like the railroad companies. They didn't like the big banks. They called them monopolies. Welcome to all of you who are coming back. I don't know what happened, but I'm back. I'm just going to keep doing what I'm doing. It kicked me out, and I'm doing it again. So that was the populist movement, right? The People's Party, and it was a breakaway from the Republican Party. When the Republican Party, after the Civil War, started to become an imperialist and pro-big business party, the small farmers, the radicals, they formed the People's Party to be in opposition to that. And originally, the populists were anti-racist. They said that racism was a tool of the bosses. They wanted black people to vote. They wanted black people to be elected to office. They were opposed to rolling back Reconstruction. But increasingly, the populist movement started to become racist. Increasingly, right? As you know, as they were opposing the Republican Party, they were accusing the Republican Party of being a sellout party. They started to frame that in racist ways and say things like the Republican Party gives jobs to black people instead of white people. And they increasingly, as they were becoming more and more separate from the Republican Party, they were getting closer to the Democratic Party. And the Democratic Party was the party of Jim Crow. And William Jennings Bryan was the populist leader who joined the Democrats. That's what he was. He took the Populist Party that had been this progressive breakaway from the Republican Party, and he took it into the Democratic Party with racism. And William Jennings Bryan, he was against child labor, and he campaigned against big business because they were doing child labor. He was in support of labor unions and organized labor. He was sticking up for small farmers. He was a populist, but he was racist. He was a very large man, and back then there were no microphones, but he could speak very loudly, and he was just an agitator. And he gave a speech. He talked about how the country was being crucified with a cross of gold, and he was for free silver, free silver. And he thought that the silver standard instead of the gold standard was the answer. That's William Jennings Bryan. And he was a Christian fundamentalist, right? At that time, there was a lot of evangelical Christianity among poor people in the United States. Poor people that were suffering would become born again evangelicals. You had traveling pastors and such. And William Jennings Bryan was very, very religious. And his last act was he tried to prosecute a man for teaching Darwin's theory of evolution in public school. In Dayton, Kentucky, there was a teacher named John Scopes. He was he was a high school teacher, and he was actually the basketball coach at the high school. But the town wanted the publicity of having a famous trial there, so they had him teach evolution to some high school kids, and then get dragged out of the school in handcuffs, and then they filmed it, and then they had the big trial in Dayton, Kentucky, and it was called the Monkey Trial. And the lawyer who defended John Scopes, was Clarence Darrow. Clarence Darrow was kind of a socialist, was a friend of Eugene Debs, a socialist labor lawyer. And William Jennings Bryan, the populist, he was the prosecutor at the trial. And it was very famous, the monkey trial, it was called, all over the country, and there were like songs recorded about it. They did a hit country song at the time, "You Can't Make a Monkey Out of Me," against evolution, and all the creationists were hoping that John Scopes would go to prison for teaching evolution. And then in New York City, H.L. Mencken, who was this very, very racist liberal writer in New York City, would make fun of the white trash hillbillies who don't believe in evolution. They're stupid, and it was very classist. The contempt. It was weird. It was New York City liberals, elites being very classist to poor people being very, very evangelical and fundamentalist, and it was this whole, it was like it was crazy, right? And it was a big distraction. And at the time, the Communist Party said it was a waste of time. And they said this is a way to divide the working class. And they compared it to, in Germany, the culture wars, the Kulturkampfs in Germany, where the Kaiser, right, that's the German Kaiser, would try to play the Catholic workers and the Protestant workers in Germany against each other by staging fights over stuff like this, right, over what Bible they would use in school and stuff like this. And the Communist Party said the monkey trial was a big distraction. It wasn't a good thing. But regardless, that was the 1920s. You had the monkey trial, the Scopes monkey trial. And the climax of the monkey's trial was that Clarence Darrow, the socialist lawyer, he called William Jennings Bryan, the prosecutor, as an expert witness on the Bible. And so William Jennings Bryan, he got on the stand and was supposed to testify about the Bible, and Clarence Darrow made an absolute fool out of him and just humiliated him. Because it was like he was arguing the Bible was literally 100% true. And so Clarence Darrow started asking him questions that made him look like a fool. And just made a fool out of him. So 2 weeks later, William Jennings Bryan died. He died 2 weeks later after the trial. It was just such an emotional, devastating blow. This man had been the presidential candidate of the Democratic Party. He was a populist who had organized for the people, but he was racist. And, at this trial, he tried to be a defender of creationism and opposing Charles Darwin. And after this humiliation, After this humiliation at the Scopes monkey trial, William Jennings Bryan died. That's who William Jennings Bryan was. I mean, and he was a mixed figure. Again, you know, I mean, he fought for low-income people. He was for organized labor. He stood up to big business. He stood up to the railroad companies. He was an agitator, a populist, but he was racist, very anti-black, very, very viciously anti-black. One of his main campaign platforms as a Democrat was that the Republicans gave federal jobs to black people. Oh my God, can't do that. You know, I mean, he was racist, and he was a fundamentalist, evangelical, opposed to science, and yeah, that's William Jennings Bryan. And it's interesting to look into, right? But then the way that the supporters of you know, John Scopes talked. I mean, H.L. Mencken was a very, very viciously racist person, and the way he talked about the poor people in Kentucky that were evangelicals was loaded in class hatred and elitism and contempt. The monkey trial was just an ugly moment in U.S. history. It was the Roaring Twenties. And William Jennings Bryan, who'd been this big populist, that was his last act. His last stand, I guess, was the monkey trial. Yeah. Okay. Next question. Back to current events. How long will these protests last? I don't know. I really don't know. I mean, if they're declaring curfews, and I mean, I have no idea. I can bet you that they're figuring out how to tone this down. But like I said, I feel like there are divisions within the ruling class right now. One section of the ruling class wants to use this against Donald Trump. The Donald Trump movement is very scared, and they kind of realize this. And yeah, I mean, this is a state of unrest like we've never seen before. Okay. I was asked by Sammy in the UK about Black Lives Matter versus All Lives Matter. Well, here's the thing. The Black Lives Matter movement, you know, was formed about the fact that the movement for Black lives, canceling student debt, providing free education, being costly, but will actually make the... Yeah, okay, right. Student debt. Writing it down. The Black Lives Matter movement was formed. It was formed because of the fact that that there was a feeling, you know, that when a black person is killed by the police, somehow they deserved it, and that there is this devaluation of black life in the United States. So when people said, well, they're racist, they say only Black Lives Matter, and said, well, how about all lives matter? The Black Lives Matter movement would get very angry about that, because they said that's our point, is that black lives are devalued compared to white lives. That was the point of their movement. And that's all there is to it. So, you know, that's why the Black Lives Matter movement doesn't appreciate people saying all lives matter. I think that's the issue there, right? And it's that you're not recognizing that there is a certain devaluation of black life in the United States. That's the issue. Yeah, I'm concerned that not everybody is here, right? Because it was like the numbers that I'm seeing here and the numbers that were there before I left. So make sure the people from the old live come back, because I don't know about, you know, when they cut the stream, I didn't see people. So there you go. Okay. What parties have been involved in the protests? Well, the reports I'm getting, I've heard that the Workers' World Party is involved. I've heard that the RCP, the Revolutionary Communist Party, is involved in getting dated. I've seen people say that on CNN they've seen people from the Party for Socialism and Liberation, the PSL, and I'm sure other parties are involved as well. They may not be out there in their own name. One thing people are saying is they're not seeing, usually at these demonstrations, you see big signs representing different parties. And you don't see that here. So that's interesting. But whatever. I mean, it's a spontaneous rebellion. Most of these people that are involved in these protests going on right now are not part of any party, right? They're not in any party. They're just people that are angry. So, yeah. All right. Small business owner. Look, I don't attach moral condemnation to hiring someone, okay? I need to be clear about that. My critique of capitalism is not a moral one, okay? It's not like I'm not saying that you know that employers are bad people for hiring someone. Yes, I recognize that employers are you know that to make a profit, workers can't be paid the value of their labor. That's a fact, but it's not. The problem with capitalism isn't that capitalists are evil. The problem is that capitalism is a naturally inefficient system where profits come before people, and that there's a need for the economy to be organized rationally. That's That's what capitalism is. That's what the socialist movement understands, right? And that, yeah, I think there will be small business owners under socialism. I think there will be worker cooperatives that function to maximize their profits under socialism. I think there'll be small business owners. There will be probably big corporations under socialism. There'll be probably state-controlled corporations, but they'll have investors and such. So I don't have a moral condemnation of business owners. Okay, I just don't. Um, Caleb, you're the only person in the media I found who I fully agreed with. Your book, City Builders and Vandals, came in. Great. Well, hey, I'm glad you fully agree with me. I don't know many people that I fully agree with, but I mean, I'm glad you like it. Give it a read. Maybe give us a review on Amazon. We could use that. Positive reviews are great. Okay. Muslims in China. Well, I mean, all religious people in China, right? The Chinese Communist Party's relationship with them has evolved and changed, right? We know that originally when the Chinese People's Republic was formed, there was a Catholic association, there was a Buddhist association, and there was a Muslim association that were loyal to the Chinese government. But then we know during the Cultural Revolution there was hostility toward all religious groups. All religious groups were kind of facing hostility from the government, and temples were smashed, and that wasn't just in Tibet, that wasn't just in the Uyghur regions, that was also in the mainland. And Catholics were persecuted, and that there was a widespread persecution of all religious people in China during the 1960s and 70s. In the 80s they changed their policy to be much more accommodating to religion. And I know that right now the Chinese government is actually promoting Islam. And they're building mosques, and they have set up a seminary where Muslims throughout China can go to the capital, to Beijing, and study Islam and study Islam's relationship with communism, and that they have scholarships where Muslims from all over China are going to the capital and studying pro-communist Islam and how Islam and the Chinese Communist Party could work together. I bet you didn't know that, right? But it's complicated. Yes, I mean the Chinese Communist Party is an atheist organization. I mean they're dialectical materialism. They're hard materialists. That's it. And that, interestingly though, they weren't the people that started that. Before Mao, you had Dr. Sun Yat-sen, who was the founder of the Chinese People's Republic, or the Chinese Republic, right? 1911, the revolution. And the Chinese People's Republic. 1911. You had Dr. Sun Yat-sen. He led the revolution to establish the Chinese Republic, right? The nationalist revolution, the KMT. Dr. Sun Yat-sen, his first act was to smash a temple, right? And there was not, China was not. It wasn't an Islamic country before the revolution. It wasn't a Christian country before the revolution. China didn't really have a unified monotheistic religion before the revolution. It had what you called Chinese religion, which was different in every region. They had different deities they would worship, different rituals they would do. Confucianism was around, but Confucianism isn't really a religion. It's kind of a political theory and a belief, and it's a certain set of values, but it's not really a religion, right? It doesn't have a narrative about heaven and hell and such. Confucianism was widespread, and there was a lot of different religion in different places. Traditional Chinese religion, they call it. But yeah, after the revolution, there was at first an effort to accommodate religious people. Then during the Cultural Revolution, there was extreme hostility to religious people. In the 80s, things started to change, and it's an evolving relationship. I mean, now Tibetan Buddhism, right? You hear all this stuff about Tibetan Buddhism is, China hates Tibetan Buddhism, and actually right now Tibetan Buddhism and tourism by Buddhists from around the world to Tibet, going to China to Tibet, is through the roof. I mean, not because of the pandemic, right? But before the pandemic, there was massive tourist influx into Tibet, and that a lot of these seminaries and Tibetan temples are being rebuilt, and tourists from all over the world that studied the Dalai Lama and studied Tibetan Buddhism were flocking before the pandemic to China. And so not everything is as you would think. Now, to be fair, I mean, we're hearing reports of repression, and again, take everything you hear from mainstream media with a grain of salt. China's relationship with religious people is evolving. And yeah, I hope that answers your question. Okay. Socialism in Africa. Well, I think that Libya, Gaddafi's Libya, with its state-run oil company, That was probably the most successful example of socialism in Africa. I mean, they had the highest life expectancy on the African continent. They called it Islamic socialism. There's the Green Book, which I'm working on publishing an edition of, which talks about it. And yeah, I mean, that's an example of socialism. But there's, the African National Congress, started out as a very socialist organization. In Burkina Faso, you had Thomas Sankara, right? I mean, there's all kinds of socialist revolutionaries in Africa. There's in Ghana, right? You had Kwame Nkrumah, who developed a theory of African socialism. You had Julius Nyerere, right, in Tanzania, right, and his theory of socialism, his scientific socialism, I believe he called it. There have been various socialist leaders in Africa. They've mostly been overthrown. Yeah, I mean, Zimbabwe, the ZANU PF is very much a Marxist-Leninist group. Ethiopia, for a while, you had the Derg, right, in the 70s and 80s, you had the Derg. Um, Taiwan is technically part of China. It is the Republic of China. It has a different government, but it is the Republic of China. They are Chinese. It's always been part of China. Just right now, it has a separate government. That's all there is to that, Sami. All right, market socialism. Yeah, I think you need a market sector in socialism. I really do. I don't think the government can run hotels and restaurants. Consumer goods. You need some market sector, but the main thing is that the economy should be organized rationally to serve the people. And that yes, you need a market sector within it, but the market shouldn't be dominant. The state should organize and control the economy to serve the people. But yeah, you should have a market sector. Tito, yes, Josip Broz Tito. He was the leader of socialist Yugoslavia. Fought very heroically against the Nazis. 1948, he had a falling out with Stalin. He was basically in the U.S. camp throughout most of the Cold War. But he developed a system of socialism where factories were autonomous and sold their goods to the state, and the workers in the factory got paid for how many goods they sold to the state. It wasn't like a state-run steel industry. It was like an autonomous steel mill owned by the workers. They would produce the steel, and then the government would buy the steel from them. It was kind of, they called it, worker self-management, they called it. And it was, in a lot of ways, though, it led to competition between factories and, inequality and such. And there's criticisms of it, but it was a way of managing socialism. I would say it was still socialist. Will China ever stop social media restrictions? Ask them. I don't know. I can't give you an answer more than that. I really don't know. Yeah. But yeah, Tito, he developed a model of socialism. It was socialism. Yeah. It lasted longer, than most of the Eastern Bloc, but it was still overthrown. But the main thing was that Yugoslavia had many different ethnic groups, and that there was an effort under Tito to try and hold those different ethnic groups together. After the fall of socialism throughout the Eastern Bloc, the USA, great book is To Kill a Nation by Michael Parenti. Very, very good book about the former Yugoslavia. I would recommend that. Someone mentioned bad air in China. Well, what's interesting is, I have friends who just went there, before the pandemic, and they were telling me that actually China has really improved, and they have an app now on phones to measure the quality of the air, and that there has been a really big crackdown. And this model city that President Xi is building, is going to be all sustainable and green technology, which I think is fascinating. Yeah, China realizes there's an issue with pollution, and they've done a lot to address it in the last few years. But you're right. There is a lot of pollution in China, no doubt about it. The country rapidly industrializes like that. That's going to be the situation. Okay. Alrighty. All right. CIA-funded cults. CIA-funded cults. Yeah, I've mentioned before, there's a book called Gangs and Counter Gangs, which talks about how the British, to defeat the Land and Freedom Army of Kenya, when the people of Kenya were fighting against colonialism, they set up these things called counter gangs, right? They realized that the Land and Freedom Army, the people were very, very fanatical. So they needed to build fanatical movements of their own to fight against them. And there's many examples of this. The greatest example of a cult that's in bed with the CIA is the Church of the Unification Church, Reverend Sun Myung Moon, right? This was a pastor in South Korea, fanatical pastor, and His movement was very anti-communist, and it was started. The South Korean government worked with the American CIA to set up a CIA of their own, like an intelligence service, and they started having Reverend Sun Myung Moon run the rehabilitation program for political dissidents. If you were a communist in South Korea and you got arrested, you go to prison, and then they would turn you over to the Unification Church, and they would try to brainwash you out of being a communist. Um, China's letter to GDR, writing it down. They would try to brainwash you out of being a communist. And they were just in South Korea, and they were just this fanatical religious group that was part of the South Korean government. They got the rights, the copyrights to U.S. weapons like M16s and stuff. So they ran all the weapons manufacturing in South Korea, and they did that. And at that point, they were in South Korea. They came to the United States in the 70s. Richard Nixon was facing, impeachment and, all this stuff. And they came to the United States as like pro-Nixon. And they recruited a lot of young people that would be hippies, teenage runaways, and, people they would say they were a peace movement. And, young people that were looking for enlightenment. They'd say, come and live in a commune with us. They looked like hippies, but they were fanatical anti-communists. And they did, stuff that people describe as brainwashing and stuff. But they weren't the only group. I mean, there was the Hare Krishna movement, which in India is a very, very right-wing movement that's very, very anti-communist. But yet, in the United States, they became this big influence in left-wing circles. The Hare Krishna movement is an example of a cult that has worked with the CIA to manipulate leftism. There's many examples. I mean, Scientology, right? L. Ron Hubbard admits he was a U.S. Naval Intelligence officer. That's before he became the big Scientology guy. He was U.S. Naval Intelligence. Now, obviously, he broke away from them. And the state, at this point, I would say U.S. media and the government are quite hostile to Scientology. I mean, they've been really raked through the coals in the media. But for a while, in the 80s and 90s, Scientology had really a lot of power. In Hollywood, they were, no one could touch them. They were really, really powerful. I think that's changed. I think they're really much on the defensive now. They started out, and again, L. Ron Hubbard, naval intelligence officer, very wealthy, sci-fi writer, guy from a wealthy family, did talk about Tito. You missed it. There's a whole history of CIA cults, right? Because communism is a movement that exhorts fanaticism from people. People give the whole of their lives, like Lenin said, to fight for communism. So to push them back, to push back against communism, the CIA has developed, cults and fanatical groups to push back against them. I mean, in the 80s, for example, when the Workers' World Party was having a protest, the Moonies would go and tear down all their posters, stuff like that. So, okay, people are asking me if I talked about, the protests going on. I spent the whole first hour that I was on here talking about that. So, yes, and we'll get back to that before we go. But yeah, okay, student debt. Well, it's interesting. It's not getting very much attention because the big situation with the protests going on right now. But Trump actually turned down a deal that would have provided a lot of student debt relief. And actually, even though veterans and others were upset with it, yeah. Canceling student debt would be better for the economy because, money, when you pay back your debt, that money doesn't really go into the economy. It just goes into the pocket of whoever's getting your payments. But if all those people's spending was freed up, yeah, it would increase GDP because they wouldn't be spending it on paying back their student debt. They'd be spending it on, buying products and doing other services. Yeah, there you go. I agree with what E.E. Camp suggested that student debt is bad for the economy. It's fictitious capital, right? And that selling debt and Wall Street, so much of what they do, nothing gets produced, right? It's not physical economy. It's just paper economy. It's moving money around, right? Lending money at interest. When you lend money at interest, you're not making anything, right? And there's a whole critique of that goes back for many, many, thousands of years, right? Okay. I don't know about China's letter to the GDR. I don't. I think this is a letter that, if I'm not mistaken, it's a letter that they wrote in the 60s when they were urging the German Democratic Republic to support them against the Soviet Union. Am I right about that? Am I correct that that's what that was? Thoughts on Trump fighting social media censorship? Yeah, Trump very much feels that Twitter and Facebook and all of them are biased against him. And I wouldn't say he's fighting censorship per se, but it's just he feels they're biased against him and could cost him the election. Um, yeah. Oh, someone's saying it's a letter that China wrote in 1989. So there you go. But yeah, they flagged his tweets as inappropriate. I mean, it's like, yeah, they're censoring. I mean, they're trying to suppress his message, and they're labeling things that he said as being, untrue and such. And I think that Trump very much feels like Silicon Valley is lined up against him, and he's ready to push back against them. And in a weird way, that points to the fact that him being there, in a way, right? Biden wants to get in there and censor social media like crazy. Him being there creates more political space, right? As much as I am not a Trump supporter, I would never endorse anything. I would never urge people to vote for Trump. I don't endorse Trump. He's, anti-immigrant, anti-Islamic. I mean, what he's saying now about shooting protesters. But I'm just telling you that Trump is very much, because he represents a faction that is at odds with some of the prevailing powers, it creates a little bit more of an opening for dissident views. So it's just something to keep in mind. Anything else, folks? Anything else before we conclude here? I'm bummed that they interrupted us, but there's not much I can do about it. Anything else? Anything else? Anything else before we conclude? Anything else? Did I have anything else I was going to say? Nope. No, I was pretty much, I pretty much said what I'm going to say. Caleb, do you blaze it? No, I don't smoke reefer, if that's what you're asking. I don't drink alcohol anymore. I've told this story before. How much more productive would working families be if there was 24-hour child care service? Amazing. Yeah, right? I mean, think about that. Yeah, I mean, child care, right? I mean, it's a big need for working families. But yeah, no, I've told the story before many times that, I drank alcohol. I never liked it. It dried me out, right? I'm always dry. And so when I would drink alcohol, it would make me even more dry. Anonymous will hack the cops. They made a video. Okay, well, good for them. I mean, whatever. But, it always dried me out when I drank alcohol, right? And I'm always very dry. Maybe I talk too much. I don't know. But maybe it's just the way my nose is or allergies or something. So every so often I would drink. So one time, my wife and I, we went to the movies. This was about 2 years ago now. And it was one of the movie theaters in New York City where you can have alcohol, while you eat. They have like a waiter who brings you alcohol while you eat. And so I ordered a drink, and I drank it in the movie, a glass of white wine, and my head just started hurting. And the movie had just started. And I drank, a sip of wine, and immediately my head started hurting. And I thought, it was July 4th, 2 years ago. And I thought, why do I do this to myself? Why do I do this to myself? My body and alcohol just don't get along. They just don't get along. They just don't get along. And so I just figured, why do it, right? Because, whatever. So, that's it. I don't drink alcohol anymore. I've never smoked marijuana. I guess I wasn't cool enough to get invited to the parties where people smoked marijuana, so I just don't do it. Yeah, I don't know. My addiction is really more to caffeine, right? Diet Coke. I love Diet Coke, right? If I'm traveling and I can't get a Diet Coke, I have to drink coffee. I am addicted to caffeine. I know I'm addicted to caffeine. First month of the pandemic, I didn't have it, but after that, I started needing it to get up again. I just did. Can China maintain its policy of non-intervention with the U.S.? I don't know what that is. Should gambling be illegal in a socialist state? Yeah, I think gambling should be illegal. I mean, if people want to gamble on their own, right? If people want to, have a poker game at their house, fine. But I don't think casinos have a role in a socialist state, right? I don't think that's right. But yeah, people gambling, that's your business. That's a personal choice. If you want to gamble at your house or whatever, right? But if you set up a gambling establishment, I don't think that should be legal. I don't think there should be casinos. Look, every city in the United States, let me tell you this before I go. Every city in the United States that's dying, Cleveland, Detroit, Pittsburgh, you name it, city dying from deindustrialization, they always come to them and say, we got this great idea. We're going to open a casino. That'll revive the city. And so usually the taxpayers end up dishing out a bunch of money to some casino, right? They can set up this fancy place with a buffet and fancy lights and all of this. And workers come and they lose money, and it's addictive, and it drains money out of the economy. And sure, yeah, a few people get hired to work at the casino, but other than that, it doesn't really do any good. Um, Ollie says we need another 10 facts about Caleb. Well, yeah, I'm not going to think of them tonight. Maybe I'll do another video on 10 facts about Caleb, but not tonight. But yeah, folks, tonight we're all worried about the people protesting, right? I mean, we had our little segue where I was just answering super chats. I talked about the protests for the first hour. Before I go, we need to get back to that, right? The Gutenberg printing press is a rapid spread of ideas. Our social media live streams now ushering in a new reformation. Well, that's a good perspective. Maybe. But I mean, yeah, I mean the Gutenberg. I mean that was a revolution. I would say that the internet and media, social media is definitely a revolution. It is a lot like the Gutenberg. It is the game changer, the internet. Yeah, I've made that analogy before, and it should be made. But let me just say that. I mean, we talked about casinos. I don't like casinos, right? I think that's. Oh, we're talking about the riots, right? Or the riots, or the protests, or the rebellion, or whatnot. Like, folks, we should all be deeply worried. As I said at the beginning, I feel like they are setting these people up to be murdered. Tomorrow, we're supposed to be seeing a mobilization of neo-Nazis that are assembling with guns to counter the protests. Trump has tweeted out, if they start looting, we start shooting. This is dangerous. This is very, very, very dangerous. It's a very dangerous situation. I've said that I've heard reports around the country that these police cars are being burned by provocateurs. I've heard reports that police officers have been killed, but then it's not clear. And this is a very, very, very dangerous situation. And we need to make sure that they don't go and massacre these protesters, right? We need to make sure of that. We have a responsibility now to support these protesters, to make clear that the government has no right to just massacre them, right? It doesn't have that right. And this situation is dangerous. We haven't seen anything like it. In my live, I talked about how this isn't a revolutionary situation, etc., the basis of it. Do you want to go back to the beginning? If you're new, if you haven't been here the whole time, that's fine. Go back to the beginning and watch where I talked for the first hour all about this protest. But this is a serious situation, right? I can get on here and talk about Tito and any day, right? But this is a serious situation in the country. And we need to do everything we can to make sure that they don't commit a massacre here. I'm very, very worried about what's happening in my country right now, right? And, somebody said to me, they said, hey, Caleb, should you really be patriotic at this time? Because a lot of these folks are tired of America and they're revolutionary and black nationalist and stuff. And I said, look, right? I've just got to tell folks, I love my country, right? I love the people of America, right? I don't want to live anywhere else. I don't. I really don't. And I don't love the capitalist system. I don't love the greed of billionaires. I don't love imperialism. I don't love racism and settler colonialism. But I love the people of this country, and I want what's best for them. And that's why this crisis is getting under my skin, because it's really got me afraid. I am very worried that a lot of people are going to be killed, that protesters are going to be killed. I'm worried there's going to be unrest and instability, and I really worry about the low-wage police state and Kamala Harris setting herself up to become the new ruler. And I'm worried about it. And if you love the United States, you have to recognize the only way out of this mess is socialism. That's the only way out of this mess is socialism. The only way we can get out of this disaster is if we have socialism, if we start to organize the economy rationally. And that's all there is to it. And I explained that earlier, but that's the case. I mean, hashtag revolution won't save America. We need to start talking about reorganizing our economy to serve the people. That's all there is to it. That's all I can say. So on that note, folks, I'll end this live the way I always end. A new upsurge in the struggle against U.S. imperialism is now emerging throughout the world. Ever since World War II, U.S. imperialism and its followers have been continuously launching wars of aggression. But the people of various countries have been continuously waging revolutionary wars to defeat their aggression. While the danger of a new world war still exists, the people of all countries must get prepared. Revolution is the main trend in the world today. While the danger of a new world war still exists, the people of all countries must get prepared. Revolution is the main trend in the world today. We need a government of action to fight for working families. We need a government of action to fight for working families. Be safe, everyone. Think of these protesters. Stay alert. Pay attention to what's going on. Don't let them get away with brutal repression. And recognize that this is the moment. This is a moment where millions of people can't take it anymore. They can't take the unemployment. They can't take the police state repression, the police brutality, the low-wage police state. There's whole communities that are just tired of this. We need a government of action to fight for working families right now. We need a government of action to fight for working families. And on that note, folks, I'm out. Have a good night.